It is good to welcome Jeffrey Kaplan on this program. He is an academic. We crossed paths when he was at the Danube Institute in Budapest, Hungary, the city which I live in, and the Danube events are some of the places that I spend my time. So we're here to discuss his book, Radical Religion in America, Millenarian Movement from the Far Right to the Children of Noah. Jeffrey, welcome to the show. How are you?
Yeah, I'm very well. Thank you. Thank you for the invitation.
Yes. So I'm guessing you're back in the USA now?
Yeah, yeah. I'm trying to live the life of the retired, but it's not easy and probably won't last long.
I see. Well, so tell me about your work at the Danube Institute.
Well, at the Danube, I went there during the COVID times, and it was still a very unformed institute. I was literally the only resident fellow at the time. We had a very small cadre of 4 young researchers. And so while we were searching for something really interesting to study, we decided, given the COVID conditions and all that, we were going to do an intensive study of anti-Semitism in Hungary. And in the process, we interviewed, since, as you saw from the Radical Religion book, I very much am an oral history scholar. And so we went out and we interviewed all of the leading figures of the Hungarian Jewish community, put together a massive international conference on the topic. And out of that came a 2-volume set of books, published in the United States, actually, that covered, I think, every aspect of the topic of anti-Semitism in Hungary as it existed in about 2020, 2021.
I see.
After that, we did quite a few things, but the major thing that we've been working on, and even from here we continue to work on, is in cooperation with Hungary Helps, which for our listeners is now a government agency. It was quasi-governmental then. Now it's part of the foreign ministry that specializes in helping Christian communities around the world. And so we created a project called Attacks on Christian Communities and Institutions. And in that, we've traveled to 3 countries so far. 3 areas. Started in Poland during the uprising against the Catholic Church, largely to do with abortion and that sort of thing. After that, we went to Iraq and spent 3 weeks in Iraqi Kurdistan. And most recently, in fact, in wartime conditions, we visited Jordan, Israel, and the Palestinian Authority. The book on Kurdistan is right now in press with Scholars Press in Great Britain. Huge thing. It'd be 500 plus pages for anybody who's interested in what's happening in Iraqi Kurdistan. And we're right now working on books on Jordan and then on Israel, Palestine. So that's primarily what we were doing at the Danube.
I'm sure it had been a very fruitful research process.
Oh, yes. Yes, and loving living in Hungary. You're very lucky to be there. It's a wonderful country and a wonderful place to be, as you can see from the flag in the background.
Yes, of course, I can see that. So tell me about how you became interested in the topic that we are going to discuss today, millenarian religion in America in particular.
Well, it's a very long story. And as you can see, I have a very long life to go with it. And essentially, I was only an academic since 1993. It was like a 3rd career for me. And before that, I spent a great deal of time in communist Eastern Europe and in the Middle East. And by chance, in Iran, in the run-up to the Iranian Revolution, 77 through 79. And it changed my life. It gave me the idea that religion was a powerful political force and the most important in terms of violence, which is my primary area, which is religious violence, millennial movements, that sort of thing. That religion could move men to do what was seemingly impossible because the revolution itself was impossible. Savak, the secret service, secret police, if you will, in Iran seemed to have complete control of everything The Shah was all powerful. I mean, you couldn't go to a public restroom without a picture of the Shah on the wall looking down at you. It was that pervasive. And yet the revolution succeeded. And that really changed my life and changed my outlook on life. So from there, after a couple of other stops, I was in Palestine at the time of the First Intifada, which was 86, 87, working with the University Graduates Union in Al Khalil, Hebron, and saw, although it was less overtly religious than it would later be, Hebron is the most religious city in the West Bank. And I again saw the power of religion, in this case, Islam. So I decided it was time to go back and get a PhD. I went to the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy and there for a year and a half and realized the last thing I wanted to be was a diplomat, and went to the University of Chicago and went into radical religion and found by chance in the library the book by Norman Cohn, Pursuit of the Millennium. And that was really the beginning of it all.
Yes. And what is a key insight that you've drawn from connecting religion and violence together?
Well, there are quite a number, but I think the most important that would interest our listeners is that millenarian violence is rare, but when it occurs, it is at the apex of forms of violence that are possible in the world, because the ultimate idea is something that is completely irrational in the modern world and thus completely missed by policymakers. That is, as the Bible says, it's always darkest before the dawn. And so the worst possible situation means that we're winning and that we, in essence, force God's hand to intervene on our behalf. It rarely works. And when it does, it doesn't last very long, as most movements that succeed, from the Abbasid Empire in early Islam to the Iranian Revolution, they invariably tend to become secularized because you can't run a government in the modern world or a world of states through religious faith alone. You have to play the game of the state. But for these movements, which are small, but they are intense and they that these movements are, when they do coalesce, will go into total violence, and atrocity is not a problem for them. Because again, it's written, there's a tribulation, there's a time. But out of it all, we will with these people because they don't compromise. You cannot compromise the word of God. And so violence, when it occurs, is total and to the end.
Right. So tell me about what millenarianism is, and to what extent is it like a trans religion? Like, is it a feature of all and every religion ever?
Yeah, millenarianism is the belief that there will be an end time. There, in the Christian context, there will be a return of Jesus, which may come before the tribulation, before the 7 years of violence and chaos. It may come in the middle, or for most modern Protestants, it would come at the end of that process, and there would be 1,000-year reign. What makes it interesting is that Jewish messianism and Islamic messianism have very similar characteristics, even though the eschatology, the end time stories, may be a little different. That in these cases, both of them see the world as perfectible. They see God as in control of all things. They see history as essentially written, that God knows the time of the end and God controls all. So it becomes a belief system that from the Bible, from the Quran and the Hadith, and from the Jewish texts, see a series of signs and portents that will lead to that end, which the believer can read and understand, can predict, if you will. And if you follow the essentially game plan in as written in sacred text, that you too can be one of the elect. You can be part of this perfect world, this perfect existence. And it exists in all three Abrahamic traditions, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. Certainly, you see parallels to it in pre-Christian religions, and in the book, it covers a lot the Asatru or Odinist movement, which is Norse paganism as recreated in the modern world, and they have something with Ragnarok that is very similar.
So you mentioned earlier about researching on anti-Semitism in Hungary. So how does millenarianism and anti-Semitism connect?
In Hungary, not very much. And it wasn't a study of millenarianism at all. It was simply a study of anti-Semitism as it exists in Hungary. But in the kind of movements that were covered in radical religion in America and the far right, it's deeply connected because they see the Jews as literally a satanic line, not fully human, are not descendants of Adam at all. And so they become the enemy. And it is to get rid of the Jews in one way or another that will allow the conditions for the perfect world to be created. They're seen as the group that has been preventing for millennia the return of Jesus.
So how does this form of religious belief more appealing to the far right rather than the far left?
Well, the far left is essentially a secular movement. Classical communism, Marxism, seeks to get rid of religion altogether. Although, if you look at the texts, what they still see elements of what would be millenarian, what we could call millenarianism, essentially a perfectible world, essentially a change in society that would make all men equal, et cetera, et cetera. But it's in a sense it's borrowed from Christianity. But the left is secular, and so in their rejection of religion or religious power, religious authority would be the best way to put it. They, outside of classical communism, classical Marxism, they have very little in common with the right-wing believers who are religious. They're very much Bible-centered, or in the case of Islam, they, very much centered on text, on a very literalist interpretation of the Quran, the practice of ijtihad, which is forbidden to Sunni Muslims and allowed only under strict conditions by Shia, which is to go into the deeper or unspoken meaning of text, basically to compare the Bible, or excuse me, to compare the Quran and current events and come out with interpretation. And in that way, they are in many ways similar to what you see in the far right and what you see in Christian apocalypticism. I do have a question myself, which really does interest me. When you asked for to do this interview, I was very excited about it because Radical Religion in America is still my favorite book. I've written 30 plus of them by now, but it's still very much my favorite. But I was wondering why you would be interested in a book 30 years old as a basis for a podcast. It got me to go back and reread it for the first time in a long time, and I enjoyed it.
Yes, I enjoyed reading it too, although I'm still in the process of reading it. Well, first, I'm interested in having you on the show since we've crossed paths at the Danube Institute a few times, and I'm interested in having you on the podcast for an in-depth conversation. And secondly, I believe I've told you about this, but I did a term paper on the subject of the book, The Turner Diaries, and the book it's referenced a lot in your text on radical religion, and so that got me interested in knowing more about this phenomenon.
Yeah, what made radical religion as much fun as it was, and is completely incomprehensible to my then dissertation committee in its previous incarnation as a dissertation, before it emerged as radical religion, was that it took an approach which was wildly different than had been seen before, which is you go out and in almost an anthropological sense, do the field. And there are literally hundreds of voices in that book from the traditions that I covered, which was Christian identity on the very far right in America, the Asatru tradition, which is in the magical neo-pagan community. It looked at the B'nai Noah, who are a very philo-Semitic or very pro-Jewish group that emerged out of fundamentalist and evangelical Christianity to follow the Jew, and anti-cult movement, which was the Watchdogs, who looked over them all and report on them. And rather than rely on the watchdogs and what virtually not just limited, no scholarship topic, I simply went out and met these people. Whether they were Klansmen, Nazis, people from Christian identity, the B'nai Noah, the Asatru Odinism people, and the anti-cult activists, and took their own voices and allowed them to speak in their own voices without judgment. And what made the book unique was that it was the first comparative text, which allowed you to compare very unlike movement and to see commonality in them. And that's what I most enjoyed about it, even though it took a while for people to catch on to it. But the book is 35 years old and still in print. So it did something right, even though the world has changed totally since then.
I see. Yeah, and I can definitely see that approach being reflected in the writing too. So if you were to, undertake a similar project, which topics or groups would you approach?
I wouldn't do it anymore. And the reason is, for one thing, it takes a great deal of energy and a great deal of time. And as you go on in your career, that time isn't there. But more important than that, when this book was being researched, it was in the very dawn of the internet age. And so most of what you saw, to give listeners are your listeners an idea of how different the world really was then. It wasn't until Windows 95 that the internet became accessible to radical movements, or indeed to people of all kinds. So what you got was a mountain of newsletters, mimeograph sheets, little magazine, and you wrote to people with real letters and asked them questions, and then you got in your car and you could take, as a grad student, you could get away with this. You could take off for months at a time and go to some of the more distant reaches in the United States and talk to people in their own homes and see this is what they profess. And it can be quite ferocious. And then you get behind the scenes and see how they really live and meet their family. And essentially, it turns, in terms of the radical right and the racist movements, it turns them from demons, a kind of distant demon, into a kind of fallible human being that are not one-dimensional. And you try to present that humanity in your writing and in your talks, in your class, in the classroom. Today, with the internet, you're inundated with material. I mean, anybody who has a computer can write a screed, can write their own little manifesto, and there are simply too many, and it means too little. So I guess I'm a dinosaur. I'm out of my time. And you come to realize and say, okay, that was my time. It was incredible to be able to do that kind of work. But do I want to sit in front of a computer screen all day, every day, like a computer gamer who has nothing better to do? And the answer is no. So what I do today are much more focused, more academic, in some ways more academic research, but still with a very large component of fieldwork in it, as with the Kurdistan, Jordan, and Israel-Palestine that we're working on now. These were 3-week fieldwork trips that covered literally the entire country. And we did 50, 60, 70 interviews in this process and made contacts where we're still doing Zoom interviews. So it still has that element, but can it be what it used to be, which is widespread comparativist? No, not anymore. And so the book and the material from that era, we're talking 90s now, is probably not even possible anymore.
Yes, yeah, I can certainly understand that. So tell me about the book, The Turner Diaries, and how it influenced some of these movements.
Yeah, Turner Diaries is interesting. The man, if you get the book today, which is easily available, free downloads everywhere. Just search it and you'll get it if it's something you really want. It was written by a man named MacDonald, which was a pseudonym for William Pierce, who was one of the original members of the American Nazi Party under George Lincoln Rockwell. He was a university professor at the University of Oregon. He's a physicist. This guy is not stupid. And it came out of an era it started as a serial, which is written in installments in the National Vanguard, which was the magazine of the American Nazi Party and its successors. And it's about the idea of creating a mass movement that will conduct a revolution against the American government and establish a government based on race. Essentially, all white, all bright, all the time. It had a sacred text, which was Mein Kampf, and it gave the believers, who were then quite scattered. Again, before the internet, there wasn't that much ability to interact on a deep basis. And it gave them this hope that they're not just crazy, they're not just isolated voices, but they can create this mass movement. And so it had tremendous influence. And the most important influence it had was on Robert Matthews, who formed a group called the Bruder Schweigen, or the Silent Brotherhood, popularly known as the Order, who were the first and only real radical right terrorist group in American history. These weren't individuals. They were, from the federal government perspective, scary. They assassinated Alan Berg, who was what we called in those days in the 70s, 80s, a shock jock, which is somebody who said outrageous things on talk radio in an era when talk radio was quite new. He was Jewish. He was outspokenly anti-right, anti-Nazi. And he, unfortunately for him, had one of the members of the order as his guest, and he humiliated him. And so one of their first acts was to assassinate him. But more important, they conducted a series of robberies, including 2 armored car robberies. And with the money that they got from that, they started financing the far right and planning a real revolution. The FBI then took them seriously. Matthews was killed, and the main members of the order are in prison, if they're still alive, which most of them are not, are imprisoned forever. Gary Yarborough, David Lane, who was a very important figure, etc. But that was the importance of the Turner Diaries. And with the destruction of the order, then the movement changed. And again, William Pierce then wrote another novel called Hunter, which gave the idea, which is still the primary text for the revolutionary radical right, which is what we need to do is become lone wolf. It was based on the life of a Nazi who went around the country in the 1960s on a campaign of assassination. He shot interracial couples in Seattle, and he'd go to another city. Larry Flint, who is the publisher of Hustler magazine, a pornographic magazine, had pictures of interracial sex in his magazine, and so he shot him and crippled him for life. He shot Vernon Jordan, who was a black civil rights lawyer in America, and became part of the Clinton administration. But what made his run so important is that the police never put together that he was one guy. They treated it as a series of unique crimes in different jurisdictions, in different states, in different cities. And so what Hunter suggested is that they thought that the believer follow this pattern, drop out of any organized group, and go around the country killing people. And that's basically what you see today in radical right violence.
Yes. So I've only read several passages of Turner Diaries for the term paper that I did, which I've received like pretty good grades on. So I'm glad that that risk
Congratulations. That's good.
paid off. It was a
Yeah.
pretty risky project, of course.
Well, with my book, you had a good source anyway.
Oh yes. One thing I noticed reading that book, and I haven't read Hunter yet, and I'm not sure if I want to unless it's for another research project, is that It is far different from perhaps the white supremacist or racist literature of, say, the 18th or the 19th century, in which authors, presumably whites, would proclaim the virtues of their race and the inferiority of the other races. But in the Turner Diaries, the white supremacists are almost under siege. They have a tone of, well, despair, well, of course accompanied by this millenarian ideal, but they think of themselves as a marginalized public. This government is controlled by Jewish people, and the society is being defiled by non-white people and such. Why this change?
Well, it's less of a change than you think. In the 1920s, a man named Dixon wrote a series of books, but the most important one became the movie, Birth of a Nation, and it was centered on the Reconstruction era after the Civil War, and it had pretty much the same premise that white Southerners are imperiled by the federal government in league with with black people who are considered to be not even subhuman at best, and they are a great danger to the race, and even more so to white women. And it had and the movie in particular has such an impact that the Ku Klux Klan, that was moribund, it was completely out of business by the 1920s, was reborn in what was called the Second Era Klan. And it did create a mass movement which affected both South and North in America. And Pierce, who is certainly an intellect and knew this history, that was the subtext of the Turner Diary, to try to create something similar. Unfortunately, Pierce, who is a really good fit, he's passed away now, was a very fine physicist, but he was a terrible author. And so as you read, the literary value of the thing is about zero. It can be unreadable in places. It's really, the dialogue is wooden, the characters are one-dimensional, but this was really a model that was in his mind, that if you could create the same kind of excitement, which in a way was millenarian in the 1920s, then it would be of value to the white supremacist community, with the goal not of the white supremacists themselves, because they're a small group, but to try to convince the mainstream white American that they're in danger, both from the Jews, the minorities, and especially from the federal government. And in this, it failed. It succeeded within the movement, but the movement is small.
Yes, yes. And yeah, the book that you referred to, I believe, is called The Klansman, right? Thomas Dixon. It was turned into the birth
That's
of.
right. That's exactly right. And it became Birth of a Nation.
Okay, so moving a little bit away from the racial discussion, at the risk of heating the conversation up further than it already is, what can you see are the differences between the Christian forms of millenarianism that you've surveyed and I guess, the pagan or the non-Christian forms of millenarianism also surveyed?
The main connection, the main similarity, and let me preface this by saying that what we're talking about here is less the pagan world, the pre-Christian world, than trying to recreate paganism in monotheistic modern society. So the biggest similarity is the idea of apocalypse. That's why the Asatru Odinist Northern tradition was so amenable for the book. But the question is, what happened to the gods? Even for those who have nothing to do with race. People in large movements like Wicca. What happened to magic? How can we remagicalize the world? And in this sense, their quest is also for perfection, not in terms of Jesus returning or the Mahdi returning, or in the Jewish case, the Messiah finally arriving after so many millennia, but to make the world a wondrous place again, to remagicalize. The gods and goddesses don't have to be literal. They can be figurative. They can be metaphorical, but the world will be different and it will get rid of hatred. It will get rid of violence. And we return to an idealized world of pre-Christian or pre-Islamic or even pre-Jewish, although that's much more tenuous, world in which, in theory, everybody got along and you see magic was in the air and hope was in the air. An ancient historian would laugh at that. But in the minds of the believer, there's still this idea of a better world, an almost perfectible world, even if if it's not theistic, if it's not about God, then we can still change the world and make it better. And in that sense, that's probably the deepest connection. And what gives them that faith is that they were raised in a society where the Christian millennium is taught in Sunday school. They may not be millenarians themselves. I mean, most Christians are not. They leave the end times for the end times. And when it happens, it happens. It's not a let's get on with the business of today. But for those who are believers, there is a connection.
So, speaking of returning to a pre-Christian world, do you see the influence of Nietzsche and his work, thus book Zarathustra in?
Zarathustra?
Yeah.
Ah, interesting question. Actually, in terms of in the magical community, to a degree, yes. In fact, there was a guy named Mike Moynihan who went through a lot of these belief systems. The last one was Satanism. While he was in that, he actually created musical scores. Yeah, he had a band that based its music on Zarathustra. It was actually very good. He gave up the idea and went to university and decided to become a professor, as we all get old and boring at some point. Revolution is a young man's game, believe me. But in the radical right, the intellectual level of most don't really reach that far. And so while this idea of man and Superman, Ubermensch, the man, the dominant individual is there and it suffuses the movement. Have they ever read Nietzsche or really understand the complexities of his work? No, but as an archetype, sure.
So the book Radical Religion in America was written in the 90s, and I'm sure the siege in Waco loomed large over its authorship.
Mhm.
And of course, the the group behind it was the Branch Davidians, and the leader being
Yes,
David Koresh.
yes.
So, how would you describe their millenarian stand?
It's an interesting question in that their outward beliefs, what they professed to be, was in fact quite millenarian. And they were trying to create a commune that would reflect these values, that would be waiting for the end times, which, if you've ever lived in Texas, is God and guns. And that's the life in Texas. But internally, they were very much what could be called a cult. It was very leader centered. It had a lot of sexuality and involved in it, and it was very manipulative. So what was seen from the outside and what was actually practiced on the inside is something quite different. The siege of Waco was an interesting story because the FBI got stuck with it, and it ruined careers, as a matter of fact. But it was something undertaken by the BATF, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. And it was at a time when the BATF was under fire for sexual harassment, misappropriation of funds. There was a lot of scandal involved, and they needed a high-profile win. And for some reason, of all of the groups that stored guns, they hit on the Branch Davidians, probably thinking they were the easiest to hit on because they had guns, but they never used them. It went very badly. They didn't understand what they were getting involved with, and what followed was literally a Holocaust. A lot of the believers, including children, were burned to death. An American scholar who's a very good one, of New Religious Movement, Catherine Wessinger, actually did the research and interviewed the survivors and all that, and found that the fires that killed everybody were actually set by the Davidians themselves. That in very much in this millenarian pattern, that if you could make the situation so terrible, so unsurvivable, so horrific that God would be forced to act, he would act and they'd win. He didn't act and they burned. But the FBI was blamed for it, including by the, in FBI reports themselves at the time. And it was a clarion call to not only the far right, but to new religious movements and even to apocalyptic Christian movements, that the government was now about to make war on them. And so out of that came the creation in the 90s of the militia movement. So yeah, it had a tremendous impact, and it suffused a lot of the interviews that I did across the board with people from the far right, from the neo-pagan community, and even the B'nai Noah had it in mind, although they were the least worried about it.
A event that preceded Waco was the Ruby Ridge standoff, and
Yes,
I believe both events were cited in Timothy McVeigh's manifesto. He's
yes.
the man who did that terrorist attack in Oklahoma City and
Mhm,
also in the 90s.
mhm.
What separates the radical right's views on the federal government of the federal government from, say, your run-of-the-mill conservative who just complains about them?
The radical right sees the federal government as conspiratorial. And it's this idea of conspiratorialism that's separated, and I'll make that past tense, because as you see from the current American election and what's happening in America, when the lunatic fringe goes mainstream, then these esoteric theories, these conspiratorialism in particular, become accessible and even believable in the mainstream, then things can go seriously out of whack. When I did this research, and in the time of Randy Weaver, who was What Happened at Ruby Ridge, and for listeners, what happened there, since the name is unfamiliar to just about everybody of this generation. Randy Weaver was a Christian identity believer. He lived a very isolated life, cabin with his wife and his child. He was involved with the Aryan Nations and would go to the Aryan Nations annual Congress and Hootenanny kind of thing. So the federal government decided he would be a really good informant. They tried to turn him by arresting him for having an illegally sawed-off shotgun, which half of Texas has, by the way, too. And tried to get him to, in return for dropping the charges, to become a intelligence asset for the FBI. He refused, went back to his cabin. The FBI showed up, and what happened was horrendous. His wife was shot in the head. His young son was killed. He was imprisoned. In the end, he was released and given $1 million settlement from the government. But it was the Randy Weaver incident that gave people that was the context in which Waco was interpreted, that they really are after us all. They're going to kill us. That is their goal, and so it must be a conspiracy. So conspiratorialism is the key link.
Yes, and yeah, since you're mentioning current events, do you think that Trump embraces this form of thinking?
Yes,
Okay.
but not on any deep level. He's a narcissist. He believes in himself, and whatever is useful. But when I'm in foreign countries, and I've been an expat and doing this kind of thing since 1973, 50 years of doing this, I have one iron rule, which is I never talk about local politics. It's bad manner. And now that I'm back in the US after so long abroad, I kind of feel the same way. It seems very alien to me in many ways. So I live in a very rural place, in almost a cabin in the woods, with my wife, my dog, her family, and I tend to think of it the same way. So I really don't care what there is happening, and I stay out of it.
Yes, I suppose yes, a cabin in the woods in a rural area is perfect for an academic, I'd say.
Yeah, it really is. Yeah. I have lots of time to write when I'm not chopping wood or or keeping the fire going for heat. Yeah.
Um, Tell me about the philo-Semitic millenarian cults, sorry, movements. I'm not sure if yeah, I'm not sure if the term cult is appropriate.
Yeah. Cult is something that new religious movement scholars quail at hearing the word. It goes back to Trelch, and so it does have a meaning,
Mhm.
but it's not pejorative. It's become a term of abuse, very pejorative term, so it tends to be avoided. But the philo-Semitic groups are much fit much more neatly into messianic movement. The one that I did. In fact, it was the first thing ever written about them was the B'nai Noah, or the Children of Noah. It was a group in North Carolina that started here, which is actually not very far from where my cabin in the woods is. And essentially, they were former Christians and from the fundamentalist and very conservative evangelical wings of American Protestantism. So they were millenarians from the beginning. And as they read and studied, they believed that Jesus maybe was not divine, that Jesus was a Jewish teacher, perhaps a prophet, and that the best thing that Gentiles could do is to get in touch with the Jewish community, with Jewish rabbis, and learn under them. They're trying to recreate a second century movement called the God-fearers, who were Gentiles who did not convert to Christianity. They did not convert to Judaism, but they followed Jewish text. And they were later joined by Christians who were, as were virtually all Christians in the first century era, Jews who had followed, who saw themselves as Jews, as did virtually all of the early Christians, and were following the teachings of Jesus. And so they want to go back to that and be God-fearers. And so in this imbibing of the Jewish texts and Jewish teaching, then they become very entranced with messianism, since they started as millenarians to begin with. And the idea that they're contributing to a world in which God would finally send the Jewish Messiah, who would be for all peoples, not just the Jews. So in that way, there's a connection, but it's a very deep connection. As the movement has now grown considerably. When I was looking at it, was when it was being formed. I just happened by accident to meet one or two of the leaders and run across some of their literature. One of their leaders, in fact, is a professor at the University of North Carolina. So I knew him from before. So I had entry into the formative stages of the movement. Today it's international. It has a big following in the Philippines, interesting. And so a lot of that messianism has gone out of it. But in the early days, it really was.
Do you believe that your book has an impact on the B'nai Noah's growth?
It's no, not on its growth at all, but on the scholarship religious studies journal. And it got them interested, and they went out and started doing the field work in the modern Bonano. I mean, I haven't really studied them since those early days. I got much more interested in terrorism and religious violence, and they are the most people could imagine and have religious violence of any kind. So they kind of went out of my purview.
I see. So, I believe I read that in American history there are roughly four religious awakenings. So, from the bu- colonial times to roughly the present. So, I wonder,
Mhm.
are we entering a fifth one, a fifth great awakening?
No, no. There are scholars who would say yes, but I think not. And there are two reasons for that. One is secularization, but more important than that is globalization. The Great Awakenings, from the First Great Awakening onwards, were very much American and American centered, and very much centered in American Protestant Christianity. In the current context, which is both secularized and globalized, if there is to be a religious awakening, it wouldn't be American and it wouldn't follow these patterns. It would be much more Eurocentric, Euro-American. I've heard some scholars, I think, who are that there are similar aspects of which particularly follow the Iranian road. But I think these tend to be Western scholars who are trying to apply Western scholarship to Islamic history. And if you study deeply Islamic history, you see these patterns constantly occurring, these kind of messianic outbreaks, kind of very violent outbreaks. But is there currently a great religious awakening? No, not at all.
Yes.
Do you think so?
I certainly believe that secularization widespread, and I'm seeing it in Europe now, would drive religious fervor, but in certain small areas. And
Mhm.
I would say that yeah, the rise of Islam in the European continent is a reaction towards the secularization or the de-Christianization of Europe as a whole. And I'm sure
Sure.
having lived in Europe, you can certainly see that.
Yeah. And you'll hear that from Prime Minister Orban quite a lot.
Yes.
No, I did one of the funniest pieces I did about Hungary was for listeners every year, Prime Minister Orban, who whatever his demonic image in the Western world, is quite urbane and can be quite funny. Quite humorous. Every year he has this kind of giant outdoor gathering in Transylvania called Tusvanyos. And several years ago, he did a speech at Tusvanyos, which talked about a book that was written in the early 1970s, a very racist novel, which saw the Europe as being invaded by the dusky hordes of North Africa, Africa, and South Asia, and that the white race would be enslaved or eliminated. And I was quite shocked to hear that. The book is Camp of the Saints. My Hungarian is extremely poor, but I picked that up immediately, and they weren't translating that, and so I got the translation when it was published from the Prime Minister's office, and it was quite amazing that he was taking that book and comparing it to the migration crisis of 2015 and occurring today. So yeah, there is a lot to be said there. But was it specifically religious? Although religion is a constant trope in Hungarian politics, and the basis, very sincere basis of Hungry Health, which is an organization I still work and am very much enamored of, very much in favor of. But there is a utilization of religious tropes in the European right, which play well in the rural area. But is it an awakening? No, it's much more a politicization.
Yes, and I actually did a podcast episode on that very book. Jean Raspail is
Yeah.
the author, The Camp of the Saint.
Mhm.
Um,
Oh, I've got to go back and hear that.
yes,
It's an interesting. It's a terrible book in terms of literary value. Somewhat better, but not much better than the Turner Diaries.
I see.
But it's getting a revival, a rebirth in the European right now. And so the Orban speech was what kind of brought it into the Hungarian mainstream. And they did a Hungarian translation of the text,
Yes.
which was very much pushed by Fidesz.
Mhm.
So yeah, but it's a politicization. The book itself is not overtly religious at all. Christianity plays a very minor role. It's race that's important.
Yes, and I'll be sure to send you the link to that episode once we're
Oh,
finished.
please do.
But yeah, something that I'm quite concerned about too is that the right, not just the radical right, but the mainstream right in Europe is just as secular as their left-wing opponents.
Of course.
Yeah, they're in some ways they're following two secular forms of civic religion, one more
Sure.
cosmopolitan, the other.
Exactly right. But remember, has been called for a generation post-Christian. And so both the left and the right come out of that cultural milieu. So that they would be anything else would be astonishing. So sure, they're secular.
So how has millenarian religion changed from the time that you wrote the book to now in the United States?
It hasn't. What makes millenarianism so interesting, or messianism in the Jewish case, is that it's timeless. What has changed, and only in terms of degree rather than actual any innovation, is that a big part of this is the search for signs and portents. And the internet and the globalization of news makes that incredibly easy. You've got too many to choose from. Whereas when I was writing the book, those who were the main seekers and the main writer, they were looking at obscure newspaper articles. They would go to the library and listen to international broadcasts. They were a lot of them were shortwave enthusiasts. And so it was much more difficult to find these signs and portents of the end than it is now. Now, all you have to do, you don't even need a Google search. My God. If I simply follow some of the social media things, once the AI bot or whatever God's name it's called sees your interest pattern, they'll throw this stuff at you in more than you can read in a day if you spent 24/7 reading it. So in those terms, that aspect has changed or deepened, but have the actual belief system, the idea of the perfectibility of the world, that there will be a tribulation, there will be a time of troubles, that the elect will be left to rule, and the others will, in the Jewish case, most interesting perhaps, they'll just kind of disappear. Nothing terrible will happen to them. It's not a Holocaust, but they just won't be there. And in Christian terms, it's a little more bloody. But be that as it may, this idea that the world is perfectible and we are the heirs to the kingdom, that hasn't changed. And it hasn't changed since the first century.
Yes. What I do believe is that I don't think it changed, but I think it's become a part of politics, day-to-day politics even. I certainly believe that having
Mhm.
observed things in both America and Europe, that politics itself, whether left or right, has taken a millenarian flavor.
I'm not sure of that in terms of politics, because what you're seeing are policy debates and demonization of the other, which can certainly be millenarian. But you're not seeing this, the millennial dream, the perfectible world, the world as God intended it, the world before sin, before the introduction of sin, before the sin of Eve, if you will, that you don't see. If a mainstream politician started going on about that, they wouldn't be mainstream politicians for long. But yeah, there are superficial aspects of it, but at its heart, the millennial dream is really not part of politics. I would be very surprised if you could find many examples of government leaders, for example, of military leaders in terms of military government who profess that or even believe it.
I think that's a good note to end on. Thank you very much, Jeffrey Kaplan, for joining the show.
Thank you very much for having me. It was a very enjoyable discussion.